Montana Territory, August 1878. The sun was just tipping over the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains when the wheel of the wagon sank into a rut, jerking the reins from Laurel Finch's hands. Dust clouded up in golden swirls as the mule brayed and stomped. She climbed down, boots striking dirt, sweat already dampening the back of her collar. Her skirt caught on the split rail gate barring the road ahead, and she muttered under her breath, shoving at the latch. The wood was warped, swollen from a summer storm 2 nights ago. She pressed her shoulder against it, but the gate would not budge. "Let me carry you through instead." The voice was low and warm, like a creek rolling over smooth stone. She turned fast, startled, then froze. A man stood just off the trail, tall and dust-covered, with the kind of shoulders that filled a doorway. He had a rifle slung across his back and a hat tipped low over eyes the color of worn leather. His shirt was open at the throat, and sweat darkened the fabric across his chest. His horse, a dun gelding, stood quiet behind him. Laurel narrowed her eyes. "I do not need carrying." He lifted his hands, a half-grin tugging at the corner of his mouth, not mocking, just amused. "Did not mean offense. Just looked like you were about to tackle that gate with your whole body." Laurel stepped back, brushing dust off her skirt. "I was." He walked closer, boots crunching dry earth. "Name's Jace Bowden. I work cattle up near Lolo Pass." "That your claim wagon?" "It is." "Laurel Finch." She kept her chin up. "My land's just past this gate." Jace leaned over, gripped the top rail with both hands, and lifted. The gate groaned, then swung wide with a screech. "Swelling in the wood. You will want to shave that edge down before it rains again." Laurel blinked. "I tried that already. Got chased off by a hornet's nest in the fence post." He chuckled, then looked past her to the wagon. "You moving out here alone?" Laurel hesitated, then nodded. "It is just me and my little boy, Gideon. He is 8. Jace's face softened. "That is brave." "No one else left to come with me," she said, voice tight. "My husband died of fever last winter. His brother was supposed to help us settle the land. He lasted 3 days before deciding he liked Helena better." Jace looked at the wagon again. "You planning to raise the cabin yourself?" "I do not need help," she said quickly. "I believe you," he said, "but I have a few days between drives. I know how to raise a wall, and I do not mind working for a meal." Laurel studied him. His eyes were steady. His hands were scarred, strong. There was dust on his boots, but not the kind that came from drifting aimlessly. He had the look of a man who did not run from things. She nodded once. "I make a decent stew." Jace tipped his hat. "Then we have ourselves a deal." By midday, they had the wagon rolled past the gate and onto the flat patch where the cabin would go. Laurel showed him the marked corners, where she and Gideon had laid out stones. Jace whistled when he saw the boy's handwriting carved into one of the posts. "G. Finch, home here." "You got a good one," he said. Laurel's voice dropped. "He has been through more than any child should." Gideon came running down from the ridge then, his dark hair sticking up, cheeks flushed. He paused when he saw Jace, eyes wide. Laurel stepped forward. "This is Mr. Bowden. He is helping us with the cabin." Gideon nodded, wary but curious. "Do you know how to build a chimney?" "Sure do," Jace said. "What kind you want? Stone or clay?" Gideon grinned, and something in Laurel's chest eased. The day passed in sweat and sawdust. Jace worked beside her without speaking too much, just enough to make the hours pass easy. He handed her nails, steadied the ladder, lifted beams without being asked. When the sun sank behind the trees, they lit a fire and sat around it. Laurel ladled out stew while Gideon poked the coals with a stick. Jace took a bite and closed his eyes. "You were not lying. About the stew?" He pointed his spoon at her. About not needing much help. Laurel watched him as he ate. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, and a scar that curved just under his jaw. She wondered what had put it there. He did not wear a wedding ring. No one came looking for him. She looked away fast, cheeks warm. "I will sleep by the fire," Jace said later, unrolling a blanket. "Keep watch, in case anything stirs." "You do not have to. I want to," he said quietly. "You and your boy deserve to rest." That night, Laurel lay on the wagon bed with Gideon curled beside her. She listened to the crackle of the fire, the soft murmur of Jace's voice as he hummed something low and wordless. She felt something settle in her chest. Not love yet, but something near it, something that felt like safety, like the first breath after winter. The next morning, she stepped outside and found Jace already splitting logs. He looked up and smiled, not the kind that asked for anything, just glad to see her. "Coffee?" she asked. "I would never say no." As she poured 2 mugs, she realized she was smiling too. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And for the first time since her husband died, the land around her did not feel like the end of something. Felt like the beginning. By the second morning, the light came earlier than Laurel expected, slipping through the pine boughs in long, pale streaks. She roused before Gideon, her knees stiff from the wagon bed. The fire had dwindled to a few coals, but Jace had already risen. She found him kneeling near the slope behind the clearing, coaxing heat from a small flame beneath a blackened coffee pot. He turned his head slightly when he heard her boots. "You sleep all right?" he asked, without looking up. "I did," she said, brushing her palms over her apron. "Gideon too." He nodded, watching the pot. "Last night I heard elk moving up near the ridge. Might be worth setting snares higher tomorrow." Laurel crouched beside him, the cool dirt pressing through her skirt. "You hunt often?" "When I need to. I prefer cattle. Animals that don't vanish when you blink." He poured coffee into a tin cup and passed it to her, then filled a second for himself. "You ever trap before?" "No," she admitted. "My father taught me to gut fish, nothing more." Jace ran a thumb along the rim of his cup. "I could show you." The offer settled between them like smoke. She took a sip, quiet. They spent the morning lifting the first frame of the cabin. Jace took the heavier beams, while Laurel steadied the base, hammering in pegs with a mallet worn smooth from use. Gideon helped where he could, fetching tools, pointing out misaligned corners, always watching Jace with a cautious sort of fascination. The boy didn't speak much, but his eyes followed every motion. By midday, the ribs of the house stood upright, casting angled shadows on the sun-baked ground. Laurel leaned against a post, wiping her brow with the edge of her sleeve. Jace set down the drawknife he'd been using and glanced over at her. "Did you always mean to come this far north?" She shook her head. "We were bound for Idaho at first. My husband had kin near the Salmon River, but after." He waited, but she didn't finish. "I stopped where the road did," she said after a while. "This land had a price I could manage, and the creek runs clean." That was enough. Jace crouched to check the level of the sill beam. "You carved out a place with what you had left. That's no small thing." She looked at him then, really looked. The set of his jaw was different when he worked, focused, patient. Not a man used to giving orders, but one who kept going even when no one else did. "Where'd you come from?" she asked. "Texas. Near San Saba." "That's a long way. My folks died when I was 17. I followed a drive north and never went back." Laurel didn't ask why. She didn't have to. That evening, Jace brought out a pouch of dried tobacco and rolled himself a thin smoke. Laurel sat across from him on an overturned crate, mending a tear in Gideon's sleeve. The fire crackled low between them. Gideon had fallen asleep early, curled in a quilt on the wagon's floorboards. Jace tapped Ash against a stone. There's a girl in Missoula who keeps sending letters. I never read them. Laurel glanced up. Why not? She wants me to come back. Says her father's got land, a store in town. But I think she's after something I'm not. What's that? Belonging that comes easy. Laurel threaded her needle through the cloth, slow and steady. There's nothing easy about belonging. His eyes found hers across the flame. Not with most folks. But sometimes you meet someone who knows what it costs. And they don't flinch when you show them the receipt. She set the mended shirt aside. You think so? I do. The fire popped, sending a wisp of ember into the air. Laurel didn't look away. I'll be staining the joists tomorrow, she said. Stains bitter. Gets everywhere. I'll wear my worst shirt. You already are. He smiled around the cigarette, then crushed it beneath his boot. Then I'm prepared. Laurel rose, brushing her palms on her skirt. Get some rest. Tomorrow's another long day. Jace stood too, but didn't move toward his blanket. You need anything before I turn in? She paused long enough for her voice to feel like truth. Just you here. He didn't answer, just gave a slow nod and stepped away, quiet as the dusk settling behind him. Laurel watched the fire a while longer, the sound of Gideon's breathing steady behind her. The frame of the cabin cast long, reaching arms across the clearing, half shadow and half promise. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and thought for the first time in months that maybe she wasn't building this life alone after all. 2 days later, the cabin had a roofline. It wasn't shingled yet, just beams laid in a clean slope, waiting for cedar shakes, but it threw shade across the clearing and gave the place its bones. Laurel stood beneath the ridge pole with her hands on her hips, tilting her head back to study the angle. Jace was on the roof, crouched, adjusting the final crossbeam. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with effort, and his forearms were streaked with pitch. Look square, she called. He rested a hand on his knee. Good. I'd hate to have to tear it down just to impress you. I'm not so easily impressed. Lucky for me. I'm not out to win anybody over. She shielded her eyes from the sun. Then why are you still here? He didn't answer right away. The hammer hung from his belt, and the wind lifted the edge of his hat. When he finally looked down, his face was unreadable. You ever have a place feel like it's waiting for you? She brushed a leaf from the front step. No, I've only ever had to make places fit. He climbed down the ladder, slow and careful. When he stepped onto the ground, he didn't move toward her, just turned to look at the house as if seeing it for the first time. I think this one fits me fine, he said. That afternoon, Gideon followed Laurel down to the creek with a fishing line looped over his shoulder. The boy had started talking more, mostly questions Jace answered without talking down to him. They returned with 2 trout and wet cuffs, and Jace had a fire going by the time they reached camp. I'll clean them, he said, reaching for the knife at his belt. Laurel handed off the fish, wiping her hands on her apron. Try not to lose the heads. I used them for broth. He nodded. Waste not. While he worked, Laurel stepped inside the half-finished cabin. The air smelled like pine and raw earth. She ran her fingers along the windowsill, just rough-cut boards now, but it would hold glass soon. She could already see where the table would go, where the stove would sit. She imagined the sound of feet crossing the planks, the scrape of a chair, the hush of wind against the walls. Outside, Jace's voice drifted up, low and calm. You ever think about putting in a root cellar? Gideon answered. Mama says we'll need one before the first frost. I can dig it if you mark the spot. Laurel stepped out into the light. You offering to stay past the roof? Jace didn't look up from the fish. I'm offering to stay as long as I'm welcome. Gideon looked between them, then stood and walked toward the creek again, whistling under his breath. Laurel crouched to gather kindling. I don't have coin to pay you. I'm not working for coin. She hesitated, then sat beside him, poking at the fire with a stick. Then what do you want? He didn't answer right away, just scraped the blade down the trout's belly, careful and clean. I don't want to drift anymore, he said. I thought I did for a long time. But I've been sleeping under open sky for near 10 years, and it turns out I'd rather wake up somewhere I know the shape of things. A place where folks speak plain. Where a boy asks me about river stones and a woman looks me in the eye like I belong. Laurel didn't move. The fire snapped between them, catching the edge of bark. You don't know me, she said, but her voice wasn't hard. I know enough, Jace said. You're stubborn, proud, and you care more than you let on. She turned her face toward the trees. That's not always a comfort. I'm not after comfort. I'm after something worth staying for. She stood, brushing pine needles from her skirt. Then finish cooking those fish. You're not much use to me hungry. Jace grinned, not wide, just enough to show he'd heard her. He turned the spit with practiced ease, and the scent of crisping skin filled the air. That night, they ate on the cabin's new floor, legs crossed, backs against the half-finished wall. Gideon fell asleep with his head on a folded jacket, and Jace passed Laurel a tin cup of water. She drank, then looked at him over the rim. You mean to keep your bed by the fire? For now. Eventually I'll have a second cot. I'm not in a rush. She nodded, then leaned her head back against the wall. The stars were just starting to show through the open rafters. I used to think I'd never feel steady again, she said. Not after he died. Everything felt unfastened. Jace didn't touch her, didn't move closer, just kept his eyes on hers. I'm not trying to replace anything, he said. But if there's room for me here, I'll earn it. She watched him for a long moment, then reached down, took the empty cup from his hand, and set it aside. There might be, she said, and then she closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of firewood and trout and the slow, cedar-sweet promise of a home finally taking shape. The first frost came early. A thin white layer clung to the grass in the hollow behind the cabin, brittle at dawn and gone by noon. Laurel stood in the doorway, arms folded tight over her shawl, watching the mist lift off the creek. The roof was finished, the door hung straight, and the windows had their panes. Inside, the walls still smelled of fresh split pine, and the hearth Jace and Gideon had laid with river stones now held a low, steady fire. She heard boots crunch behind her, and Jace came around the side of the cabin, hauling a bundle of kindling under one arm. His knuckles were scraped raw from digging the cellar the day before, but he moved like he didn't notice. Morning's colder than it has a right to be, he said, setting the wood beside the door. Winter's warning, Laurel said. We'll need to split the rest of the stacked logs today. Jace nodded, brushed frost off his sleeves. I can do that while you and Gideon pack the jars into the cellar. He said you put up plums? 6 crocks, she said. And some green beans, though they might not keep long. Jace leaned against the doorframe. You ever think about keeping a cow? I did, but the coin ran low after buying the glass panes. I've seen a man near Fort Owen with a heifer he'd trade for preserves. We might take a wagon down next week. Laurel didn't answer right away. She watched the last of the mist lift from the field, the way the sun caught the grass and turned it gold again. You planning to still be here next week? Jace didn't blink. Unless you say different. Laurel nodded, slow. Then we'll make that trip. That afternoon, Gideon helped Jace with the chopping. Laurel watched from the kitchen window as the boy handed over logs and lined up the split pieces along the wall. Jace never raised his voice. He let Gideon figure out the rhythm of it, let him miss a few times and try again. When Gideon finally got the kindling to break clean, Jace just gave a quiet nod and passed him another. Later, while Gideon napped in the loft, Laurel sat on the porch shelling beans. Jace came up with a tin cup of water and sat beside her on the steps. They didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the soft pop of the pods and the wind catching dry leaves in the cottonwoods. "I never learned to read," Jace said suddenly. "Not more than a few words." Laurel didn't look at him, just kept working. "My mother taught me. She used to read scripture in the evenings, soft as a lullaby." "I'd like to learn," he said. "If you're willing." She set a pod aside. "We've got a Bible inside. And Gideon's primer. You'd teach me? If you want to learn." He looked toward the field. "I've wanted that a long time. Just hadn't had someone I trusted to ask." She shifted, brushing bean skins from her lap. "Well, I'm here now." His gaze moved back to her. "I know." It was the way he said it that settled something deep in her ribs, like a beam being placed just right, snug and sound. That night, after supper, Jace stayed behind when Gideon climbed to the loft. Laurel lit a single lamp and pulled the thick Bible from the shelf. She laid it on the table, smoothing the worn leather. Jace sat across from her, elbows on the wood, watching her hands. "Try this," she said, tracing a word with her finger. "Start here." He leaned closer. "In, the, B, Jin, and G. Beginning," she said gently. "Was, the, word." He looked up. She smiled, just a little. "That's right." He let out a breath like he'd been holding it a long time. "Doesn't feel real." "It is." They worked until the lamp guttered low. When she finally closed the book, the room was warm, still. Jace didn't move to stand. His hands stayed on the table, close to hers. "I never had much I could keep," he said. "No land, no name that mattered. But this feels like a place I could belong." Laurel didn't speak. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His fingers curled around hers, careful, like he was afraid to press too hard. "You do belong," she said. "Right here." She stood then, slow, and he rose too. Neither of them needed to say more. Outside, the wind shifted. The first leaves loosed from the trees and drifted down like slow-turning promises. And inside that cabin, under a roof they'd raised together, a quiet kind of forever began to take root. The trip to Fort Owen took them a full day's ride along the valley road, with Jace driving the wagon and Gideon wedged between them, wrapped in his wool coat and watching the sky for hawks. Laurel brought a sack of dried apples, 2 jars of plum preserves, and 3 skeins of homespun while she dyed with walnut husks before the first frost. Barter had always been a language she spoke well, and she spoke it again now with the dry-eyed certainty of someone who had once traded a wedding band for a sack of flour. The trader was a German man named Vogel, hair white as fleece, with a cow tethered behind his barn and a wary look about strangers. But he softened when Gideon offered a quiet "Good day, sir." And Laurel laid out the preserves with the careful pride of a woman who'd boiled each jar to seal it by hand. "She's a quiet one," Jace said, nodding toward the heifer. "She calves early and eats her weight in hay," Vogel replied. "But she's steady." Laurel met the man's eyes. "So are we." Vogel scratched his beard, then nodded once and shook her hand. They hitched the cow behind the wagon and started back before dusk settled in pink across the peaks. That night, Jace built the fire higher than usual while Gideon brushed the cow down in the lean-to they'd finished just that week. Laurel brought out a bowl of cornbread she'd baked before they left and handed Jace a slice without speaking. He broke it in half and passed her the larger piece. She didn't refuse it. "I've been thinking," he said after a while, not looking at her. "Come spring, we could fence off the eastern slope. Let the grass grow long and keep the cow there." Laurel sipped her tea. "We'll need to fell more pine. I can mark the trees. I'd like to build us something more permanent, too. not just the house. A life that holds together when the wind comes. Laurel looked down at her hands. The knuckles still bore the faint stain of walnut dye. You already started that. He turned to her then, and the fire lit his face in amber. Say it plain, Laurel. If you want me to stay, I will. But if you can't see a future in this, I do. Her voice didn't waver. She set her cup aside and laced her fingers together in her lap. I do, she said again, slower this time. I want you here. Not just for the planting or the roof work. I want you beside me when the nights stretch long and the snow presses up to the windows. I want you beside me when Gideon grows tall and starts asking harder questions. I want you beside me when my hands can't hold a needle steady anymore. Jace bowed his head, then reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough, but warm. Familiar. I'll build you that kind of life, he said. If you'll let me. She nodded. I will. They didn't kiss then, not yet. Instead, he pulled her hand to his chest, over the place where his heart beat slow and sure. They sat like that until the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in silence. By late November, the first rail snow came down from the mountains and blanketed the valley. The cow bore up well in the lean-to, and the root cellar stayed dry. Jace moved into the cabin proper, sleeping on the cot beside the hearth while Gideon kept to his loft. They read by lamplight in the evenings, and Jace learned to write his name without hesitation. One morning, Laurel found him carving letters into a small strip of pine. She watched as he etched it clean, each stroke careful. When he handed it to her, she traced the name with her thumb. Bowden Finch. I thought it should be all one name, he said. If you'll have me. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and certain, her hand resting on the back of his neck. When she drew away, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Yes. They married before the thaw, with Gideon standing proud in his best shirt and a neighbor woman from across the ridge as witness. The ceremony was quiet. No rings, just words spoken over the hearth and a promise forged in work and care and the slow, patient choice to stay. Years passed. The cabin grew by 2 rooms and a porch shaded by cottonwood. Jace built a second lean-to and a smokehouse. Laurel taught reading to children from homesteads up and down the valley. Gideon grew into his father's height and his mother's quiet strength. He carved his own name in the same plank where Jace had once written theirs. On warm evenings, Laurel and Jace sat side by side on the porch steps, hands touching, watching the sun slip behind the trees. They didn't speak much anymore, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had said all they needed and trusted it to hold. Laurel sometimes thought of the woman she'd been when she first stepped off the wagon, tired and hollowed out. She felt that ache now only as a memory. Because the woman she was became someone new, and not through rescue, but through choosing to build again with someone who met her in the work and stayed. And Jace, who had once wandered from one season to the next with nothing tethered, now woke each morning knowing the shape of his days, the feel of her hand, the sound of a boy's voice turned man. They had made a life that held. And in the long years that followed, it never once came apart.